of Carl's Open Education Working Group. Many of the work that's been produced in our documents come from that group and supports this committee. So I'm very pleased to be chair for Carl for that group. On our advocacy and federal funding panel discussion this afternoon, we have Babb, who's the Open Education Project Manager at Spark. We have James Casey, who's research and policy analyst at the Canadian Federation of Students. Unfortunately, this morning we heard that he's not well, so he won't be joining us, unfortunately, for this panel. We have Susan Haig, Executive Director for Carl. We have Don Moores, President of Temple Scott Associates, and I believe he's online with us. We have Mackenzie Metcalf, Executive Director of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associates. Michael McDonald, Manager of Government Relations and Policy at Colleges Institute Canada, and Michael's also online. This is our panel. Just as a way of getting started, we have a series of questions we've asked our panelists ahead of time. They have prepared some responses, but we're going to begin with each of them for about 1 minute introducing their work in advocacy, where they've anchored their work, just to hear a little bit more from their perspective. So can we begin with the order? Can we start with you, Haley?
Sure, I'll show you the mic. Sorry. Okay, hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. My name is Babb, and I'm the Open Education Project Manager at Spark. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Spark, what we are is we're a membership association of academic research libraries, primarily across the US and Canada, but we do have global affiliate partners in Europe, Japan, and Africa. So I'm coming to you in that capacity. I'm also a former student leader from the University of Lethbridge, and actually a former CASA delegate. So happy to share a little bit of my experience from that time in my life as well. And I'm based in Edmonton, Alberta.
Thank you, Haley. Susan, can we have you go next, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Susan Hagig, Executive Director of Carl, and I'm a librarian, first of all, and I wanted to mention as well that I had 28 years as a federal civil servant. So I worked for LAC, so that it enters your consciousness, the federal government and how it works. My position is the lead for advocacy from Carl, federal advocacy especially, because I'm based in Ottawa, and it is supported and guided and informed and strengthened by a director level committee, the policy committee, a policy team, which includes visiting program officers from across universities, as well as a secretariat from Carl's staff itself, and Temple Scott Associates. I wanted to say just one more thing. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, so why we advocate is for policy and sometimes for funding that will advance and enable the Canadian post-secondary education dual mission, education and research. So it's not about us. It's really about the broader environment that we tend to advocate about. And what we advocate for, I would say, is a mixture. Sometimes it's policy or legislative reform, so copyright, open government, privacy, internet-related policy, open access, and so on. Sometimes it's for funding, and I can talk more, and I probably should, about some of the successes we've had there. They're quite different, and that's important too. Our biggest success, and one that we've mentioned already this morning, was this digital research infrastructure funding and the new alliance that was formed, and our engagement with that was quite considerable. So I'll talk about how maybe a little bit later, but that's it for now.
Thank you, Susan. Don Moores online with us.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Don Moores. I'm the president of Temple Scott Associates. We are a government relations firm. We've worked for quite a while now with Susan and Carl on a variety of issues that she outlined. My expertise is in advocacy. I'm active across a number of sectors, not just in the library sector, and pleased to be here today and speaking with everybody.
Thank you, Dawn. Mackenzie Metcalf.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mackenzie Metcalf. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations. We are a member-based organization based in Ottawa, Ontario, that advocates for accessible, affordable, and equitable post-secondary education, representing around 360,000 students from across Canada. We advocate on a number of different issues, including open educational resources and copyright. And I am based in Ottawa, Ontario.
Thank you. Michael McDonald, online.
Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here. My name is Michael McDonald. I'm the manager of government relations at Colleges and Institutes Canada. We represent the over 140 publicly funded colleges, CEGEPs, and polytechnics and institutes across the country. I've been in the post-secondary education advocacy field for a while now. I'm a previous executive director of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations, CASA, so people are nodding because I know them from other worlds. I've also been assistant director of government relations at Universities Canada and have been around on the OER front for a while now, and delighted to have this conversation.
Wonderful. Okay, we're going to begin with a set of questions now. Our first question goes to Dawn and Susan. I think, Dawn, you're beginning. In your view, what is the best strategy for advancing federal funding for open education resources? Or another way of asking it is, what is the best alignment that you would recommend?
Sure, thanks. So happy to kick things off. Maybe start with a kind of truism in government relations, which is government relations is most successful when you merge your priorities with your audience's priorities. So I think a big mistake a lot of advocates make is that, of course, people come to Ottawa, use Ottawa as a context, that's where I'm based, to talk about what they're passionate about. But, you know, MPs, government officials, ministers, ministerial staff, they literally see upwards or hear from sometimes hundreds of people a day that are passionate about a wide variety of topics. And so how do you cut through that? You have to find a way to merge what you want to do with what your audience is trying to do. And there's many ways to identify that. And sometimes it's somewhat different in terms of the political stripe of the member of parliament you're meeting with, whether it's a public servant or a minister or ministerial staffer. But at the 100,000 foot level for this, obviously, cost of living is a key priority for just about everybody in Ottawa right now. Cost of education is an important priority. Sometimes you'll hear federal officials say it's a provincial issue, and I'm sure this will come up in terms of our strategy and our talk. But at a large level, I would recommend, how are you tying what you want to have done in the OER space to what the government's trying to do, would be sort of step one. And I think this idea that if you think about the Liberal government, they view their role at sort of the 10,000 foot level, again, as one that wants to sort of say, look, in terms of making Canada better, there are certain groups that the system, and I'll just use that word largely, operates to disadvantage them almost systematically, sometimes more than systemically, excuse me. And as a government, we have a role to correct those systemic issues. And if you look at sort of access to open educational resources, I think that fits quite nicely within that framework, sort of really to dumb it down to say you shouldn't have to have a lot of money in order to educate yourself, in order to increase your economic prospects in life or pursue your field of study. And you see the Liberals take this issue up in terms of talking about high-speed internet as a basic human right sometimes, or something that they try to contribute to all Canadians. And underlying that is this idea that, you know, people shouldn't have to not be able to afford internet. And I think you can make the same case that people shouldn't have to not be able to afford the textbooks that they have to further their education. I guess the last point I'll make is that another truism in government relations is you're most successful when you have a confluence of voices. And so it really requires a coordinated effort amongst the groups that are here today and others that care about this issue, where your information sharing and making sure that you're building off each other in terms of your advocacy efforts, that you're understanding where you're making progress, what some of the challenges that are being raised in meetings, how you collectively address them, and you're coordinating both your tactics and your message. So those are kind of the two, I guess, opening points that I wanted to emphasize.
Thank you, Dawn. Susan, anything to add?
I wanted to just expand a little bit on the hows in terms of the differences that depending on where you're going and who you're talking to. So with the politicians, of course, it's very simple. They're more interested in their legislators. So they care about legislative reform. They're interested in asking you, very succinctly, what is the problem? How does it affect their constituents? What do they need to understand? What can they do to help? That's it for politicians, I think, really, and therefore for their offices as well in some ways. For officials, and I think personally at the moment we need to find our way into officials to sort of see who is a likely source to tap for what it is that we want to achieve. They need more substance, and Carl tries to make sure that we have substance, that's what we are bringing, that we are able to understand that they're going to need to have answers to questions, precise answers, real detail, options evaluated, costs known, and so on, because they have to take those forward. They have to do a memorandum to cabinet and then a treasury board submission, whatever, to get new money. If we're talking new money, which we may not be talking new money, but if we are, then we have to know what we want to achieve, how to get there, and we have to know who to speak to.
Thank you, Susan. Mackenzie.
Yeah, just to build off some of the points that were said and make it a little bit more specific to OERs as a concept, I think it's important to notice, as I mentioned before, is that how OERs are received to the people that you're talking to. And the thing that I found in academia and in student politics and in working around this is that OERs are kind of hit or miss. You either really, really love them, and I'm sure that's the people that are around the table today, or you don't want to touch them with a 10-foot pole because you don't understand them and it's really complicated and kind of a black box. So a good way to break down this barrier, because that will exist in decision makers as well, is to first find the champions who love what you're talking about and see the innovation that these kinds of resources can bring. And for the people who might be a little skeptical about what an OER is and how it can help them, providing real world tangible examples to get them on board. And I always use the example of my father, who's an engineer, who if I talk about the price of textbooks or the price of education, he'll be like, well, that just is what it is, right? Like you have to pay for a book, you have to pay for resources, but then in the same breath, he'll complain about his upskilling and how it's so expensive. And sometimes if you frame it in a different way, you can get the same people on board. And then also, again, tying it to some specific government initiatives that are happening right now. A lot of governments are really resonating with the idea of reskilling and upskilling workers, specifically in their transition to a green economy. So this is a great way that OERs fit into a specific and current government priority.
All right, thank you very much, Mackenzie. We have another question, and I think Haley is going to lead with this, and then we'll follow with Michael. What challenges might come our way, and how might we meet them? Another way of asking the question is, what assumptions do we need to test or challenge? Haley, can we begin with you?
Yes, we certainly can. So I'm going to tap back into a little bit of my experience doing direct lobbying, which, please keep in mind, my experience is pre-pandemic. Things have changed a little bit. But in my experience as somebody who has brought this issue forward to policymakers, I personally have actually experienced very little pushback to the idea itself. I think most people can agree that this is a great initiative. This does wonders for the common good. I think where we find troubles and where we perhaps maybe begin to hit a roadblock kind of follows on the point that we were talking about briefly before lunch, but helping, if it is a federal ask that we're looking for, how do we convince the federal government that this is their problem to take up? As we all know, this is a provincial issue primarily, and I think we need to be having at the forefront of our minds how we're going to make the case to the federal government that this is something that is worth them spending time and resources on. And also, why is this an issue that the provinces alone cannot solve? Why do we need them to come in and be another player in the field here? So that's something to keep in mind. I also think that an important assumption for us to challenge may or may not be the idea of, if we do the work of, researching and presenting this issue to government, that they, will do the work of solving it. And I think that's absolutely not the case. I think we as advocates, what we need to focus on here is sort of twofold. One, determining exactly what it is that we want, which is sort of why we're all here today to talk about a little bit more, but also balancing that with making it easy for governments and policymakers to say yes to us. How do we present this in a way that makes it very appealing, is in the public interest, or the party's interest, I should say, to advance this priority? Can we be giving them a quick and easy win that we hand to them on a silver platter, making it easy for them to implement? So, obviously my pie in the sky dream would be to see some robust federal funding for open educational resources. I think there's a lot of steps that we can take beforehand. I don't think we necessarily have to, as we've seen with the previous 2017 ask from CASA. The appetite is there, and particularly our liberal government is interested in this work. We can see this not only through the traction that the 2017 CASA ask got, but also through initiatives like our government was actually, the Liberal government was the one that reinstated the Canada's chief science advisor, and so who went ahead with the open science roadmap. That's something that had previously been scrapped by the Harper government that the Liberals brought back. So is this something that we can sort of capitalize and say the momentum is already there? Here's how we can now take this sort of philosophy that we know that this government is on board for and take it to the next step, specifically concerning OER. Another thing that was just really quickly before I hand this off, I think if we do that, one thing to keep in mind, and this was also brought up directly before lunch, but keeping in mind sort of the politics between the federal government and the provinces. I'm from Alberta. I know this all too well. I think we need to definitely keep that in mind when formulating an ask, and making sure that this is something that, if we're asking the federal government to do something that may or may not be encroaching on the provincial mandate directive to organize education in the province, that's something that's not going to create political tension. So those are just a few opening thoughts from me.
And Michael, would you like to respond to that question?
Absolutely. Again, I would echo like a lot of what the other panelists have brought up. I do want to highlight, and again, I'm going to be talking about the challenges, but I'm going to highlight by one of Don's first point, which is like affordability is number one right now in Ottawa, and that's a question that again it was reiterated in meetings again and again and again. So then, what's our challenge here on open OERs, and like why doesn't this just happen? And I guess I would fundamentally say like, one thing to be very careful of is I think everyone in the OER community thinks this is a really good, almost self-evident idea. And it is for most people not self-evident at all. And it sounds like jargon. And I really do want to stress that you kind of need to walk back from the fact that you think this is a good idea and start unpacking some of the key deliverables that this idea will provide other folks. So I'll quickly get into places where, and again, not to be the Debbie Downer, but I think I'm supposed to be playing this role a little bit on this panel. So it's a couple of places where I think that we need to acknowledge things. One, for your average Canadian, this is not a voting issue. This is not something that would be clearly understood. And everyone saying OERs all the time doesn't even help that discussion. As an acronym, like the golden rules of like, these are just acronyms and it's acronym soup for most people's experience on this. And for a lot of people, and that means that then it's going to be a subset question. And then you're going to need constituencies that are going to say it's important. So in this instance, I think that one of the things that becomes particularly important about the kind of coalition of people you bring around the table is those constituencies, be they students, be they professors who potentially would be funded through this, be these institutions, need to show that this is a priority. Like it needs to be up there, and one of the things they care about, they go into meetings about. It's not 12th on my briefing note. I assure you there's never a number 12 on my briefing notes. But like in those instances, it's being able to find that people are willing to expend some of their political capital and express ways that they would matter to their constituencies, and to be able to show that that would have resonance and value for them. And then I would say, I think one of the challenge places about this specific ask is that we kind of take some of the value gains from it as self-evident. So we'll throw out a stat on the nature of textbooks cost X amount. okay, so what is this actually going to deliver to students from a cost savings front? Quality is an extremely hard thing to measure and extremely hard to assure. We can assert that it's going to be it could even be better, but how do you establish that? Either through examples, through case studies, through ways to be able to anchor the idea of its utility very much in the mind of a public servant who's having to evaluate this piece. Third problem, I would say, like that this comes down to is, again, on affordability matters, which are important right now. The federal government's going to evaluate lots of good ideas. They're going to look for the ones that they're able to explain quickly, explain clearly to the constituencies that matter, and that they're sure that they're going to get some good bang for buck on. And in this instance, they're again going to be looking at this one. And I would be a little, again, with some provinces having taken steps into this place, again, like eCampus Ontario, the activities that have been done in British Columbia, really positive stuff. The feds might go, I'm just not needed right now. Like, what's the other sell point here? Why do I actually need to do this? And why am I going to get credit for it as well? And that's another point that can sometimes matter, especially for a minister's office when they're making the read on this. Like, how are we going to be able to own this and be able to say to people that we've established the benefit? The last piece on here is something that is an external threat that I would flag that is not directly related to this, but it falls into the sea of the challenges around this. And that's around the discussions around copyright right now. These two things are different. These are on different ongoing discussions, but because there is ongoing tensions around copyright and how creators are compensated, I said, which is likely the department that this could potentially be living in, and heritage, maybe your other option, are somewhat skeptical about anything that's seen as taking funding away from publishers, creators, and in other contexts. So you have an essential, they don't necessarily know if these things run up against each other, but with how complicated the Copyright Act is and how active those battles can be, it can lead to hesitance on the part of a public servant who might be like, I don't want to put my toes into waters I don't fully understand here. And that can be something that just means that they look on to another idea that they might either have more active advocates on, or they might just be able to understand more clearly. So again, not to be the Debbie Downer, I think that was my role on this panel, but thanks, folks.
I think it's called wisdom. So thank you very much. So we're going to move to the third question, and there'll be time for you to ask questions and to build on what others have said from this panel. From your vantage point, what is the most compelling pitch to federal funders? How should this be approached and why? And Dawn has already, maybe provided some perspective on that. So Dawn, anything that you would like to add to what you've already said?
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. I think, to me, the kind of thread I would build it around is this idea that access to, like, the right to educate yourself is a right that the government should promote, and it shouldn't be dependent on income or resources. And really delve into that theme, that this should be a basic right, that, the government can't solve the idea of free tuition. I mean, I know that would be like a dream, but this is one way they could contribute to try to help achieve that goal. And, for this government, I think, quite frankly, when they look at problems, if they think they're solving a problem for someone that makes, family income of $150,000 a year, then it's not really a priority for them. But if they think they're solving a problem for someone that makes, a family that makes $40,000, $45,000 and under, then they are quite willing to engage. There's also other populations, Indigenous populations, French language. I mean, I know that we're not talking about this, but these are other themes that can be tied in. If I could just return the compliment, I mean, I agree a lot with what Michael said, and I really want to highlight the last point. I don't actually take it as a given that the creators and publishers are going to think a push on open education is separate and distinct from a push on copyright. So I would expect and be looking for some pushback from them. And the fact that a lot of the same people that are pushing and having issues around copyright and fair dealing now are the same ones pushing for OER might even confuse the matter more. So I would just say we need to kind of peel our eyes out for that. And the last point I would make is, this is going, like the political constituency, the government's going to think that they're helping here and that winners here are students. And so to Michael's point, and I'm not saying that it is, but if this is like the 15th priority for students and they don't think that the students really want this or that the students are going to back this, then I don't think it's going to be something that politicians really get behind, because this will be seen as a relatively affordable way they can address cost of living concerns for students. So they're going to want to really understand, or will be confused if everybody's telling them this is a great thing for students, but they're not hearing it at the door or from students or from student groups. So that would be kind of my last point.
Thank you, Don. I think we have Mackenzie and Haley who will no doubt have more to add on that point. Mackenzie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think that was the cue for the students to talk. So the one thing that I wanted to kind of stress was the lens that the government is looking at everything through right now, which is affordability. This was kind of mentioned before, but the cost of living is skyrocketing. And even if they look at something like infrastructure investments for OER, the affordability lens is going to be what takes this from this is a good idea to this is something we need to do now and that we need action on from this government. And that I will also speak a little bit to some of the challenges that we face in getting students to advocate for open educational resources as well, because like I said, I find there's either people who really, really love this or people who kind of see it as a black box that and they're scared by acronyms. So again, even in convincing students that this is something that is important and these are the wins and the affordability savings that you would be able to get from this ask. Affordability is, again, just top of mind for students, just as it is for government. And then again, retying it into other government initiatives like reskilling, upskilling, and the need to transition different workforces into the new green economy that this government is trying to create. Like that was just 4 liberal key messages in one that if you slide into OERs is going to make somebody's ears perk up, right? So that's how I would, at least from my vantage point, try and start creating a compelling pitch for funders.
And Haley.
Thank you. Yeah, Don and Mackenzie sort of took a few of the points I was going to make, so I won't repeat them, but I did just want to highlight what I think is so key is the return on investment that's possible here. I've spoken before about how, I would really love to see personally, eventually, maybe not right away, a grant program come back. I did just want to talk a little bit about sort of a similar model that we see in the US. So we mentioned a little bit the open textbook pilot. That has been a program that's been ongoing for a little bit over 5 years in the US. It started out with a $7 million investment that's now grown to $11 million per year. And that project typically funds 1 to 5 grants between about $500,000 to $2 million dollars per project. So a stat I just wanted to share was that since 2018, there's been 16 projects funded with an estimated 200 million student savings on a $35 million investment. So that's almost a 3-fold return. And I think a stat like that, being able to take that to a legislator and say, here's a small amount of funding that you can put forward year after year. I think in the scope of a federal budget, $7 to $10 million is really a drop in the bucket when you're looking at a national federal budget. And to have such a significant return on investment like that is just so powerful. And I think it's something that sort of transcends partisanship. I think, we see a lot of support sort of across the aisle on initiatives that happen in the US, but also here in Canada. Alberta, our provincial government right now has expressed their support for open educational resources, a more conservative government, as well as, the liberal government federally. So this is an issue that really does appeal to people all across the spectrum. So I did just want to highlight that, I guess. On top of everything, I think no matter what our ask is, I think the most important thing is for this to be unified. It's extremely powerful to be able to approach a legislator as you know, a united group representing, you know, this many different stakeholders and this many different areas of study. Something like that is much more powerful than individual advocacy. And obviously, you know, that is why we're all gathered here today. But I think most importantly is how can we settle on an ask that is appealing to all of us and that all of us can 100% get behind. So that's important. I also think that when it comes to lobbying, that persistence is key. You know, this may not be a win on day one, but consistent messaging year over year, something that we can stick to, I think is something that is going to be important, that will resonate. Let's say, you know, we advance and ask that, you know, less through, you know, this government, and then say we have another government come in that, you know, perhaps that's not a priority. That's also something to think about, like how can we determine something that's appealing for everyone and that, you know, may not necessarily get politicized in our climate. So yeah, that persistence, the sustainability, you know, is there sort of an annual lobby week that we can attach ourselves to? That's something that CASA does really well. Is there, you know, one specific ask that we want to ask for, or perhaps, you know, 3 that we sort of stick to year after year and sort of become known for? So that's a long-winded answer, but yeah, some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Haley. I think this leads perfectly into the next question, which I think we've also asked you to respond to, and others on the panel. How might you suggest we frame our priorities for open education infrastructure in particular? And so maybe you could add some additional thoughts, but inviting the other panelists to jump in if they wish.
Sure. So a lot of what I have sort of written down here has already been said. I think it's so important for us to have some sort of centralized mechanism for building and maintaining relationships with government legislators, whoever it may be. Like I said, policy is not one and done work. This is something that happens over years, over time, over budgets, over governments. And so, you know, is there work that we can be doing internally to appoint, you know, a group of individuals who are responsible for building and maintaining those relationships? That's what's going to get our foot in the door. Again, want to give a big nod to CASA. That's something that they do really well, being able to, you know, get opportunities like being invited to present on the pre-budget submissions, et cetera. So figuring out how we can do that. I think also tailoring asks to the government of the day and helping them, I wrote down here, make them look amazing. So like, you know, obviously none of us are in this work because we want the credit, but really ultimately it's not about us. Like, how can we set this up to say, oh, you know, the Liberal government did this and they're just so amazing because they care so much about students. Like, let them take the credit, let them wave it around. At the end of the day, we've got our ask and we're able to go, you know, back to our constituents and say, like, this is a win, you know, we're able to implement it. So, you know, not having that about glory for us, but making those policymakers look awesome. I talked again about sort of the power of joint asks coming together. And what else do I want to say? I guess this is just sort of an interesting anecdote, but something I observed just sort of being in on sort of American policy talks. When you're framing an ask, obviously, you know, there's a very different political system in America. I'm not equating it directly, but talking to Democratic legislators, you want to frame the issue as related to freedom. As related to justice. When you're talking to Republicans, you want to frame it as related to freedom. So how is there, like, what's the equivalent here? Obviously, we have a multi-partisan system. It's not one or the other, but how are we taking that sort of same concept and, you know, approaching the government of the day to say, you know, these are your values and this is how this meets your values. And then the last thing I'll say too is not only lobbying one government, not only lobbying the government that's in power, because you never know what is going to happen over the next little while. So yeah, I think I've talked a lot on that one, so I'll hand it off to someone else.
Okay. Susan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I just, I appreciate everything that's been said in terms of the wisdom of it. And I think I would endorse everything that was just said as well. I feel like the framing, the ideal framing may need to be a little bit iterative. Like I think we need to talk figure out what will resonate, what does work. We need to become increasingly clear about what we're asking for. I've said that repeatedly, but I think it's really important that, so we need to, it's very true, this persistence and the sort of solid voice and putting these proposals into pre-budget submissions and so on, very, very helpful. But we need increasingly to know what we're truly asking for. And I think, to make clear, it's a small point in some ways, but it's an important one, I think, is that to the federal government, we need to be clear that we're not asking for 100% federal funding to, that it is solved. They need to solve this issue on their own. I feel like there's a part of it, there's some things that they could fund that are the things that they do fund. That's part of the message, that they care about Indigenous content, they care about official bilingualism, they care. So that's two of the reasons, I think, why we have those as priorities in our thinking. They care about evening out across the provinces, so that there's a national fabric that works for everybody. So trying to pitch it in terms of the things that the government does consider their responsibility, and to be clear that there are other players playing roles that could be helpful as well. Coordination, like, if we need a small national body to coordinate, let's be clear that it's a small national body to coordinate, and maybe try to find a home for it. Or, and this was the case with the, at the time it was called the Leadership Council on Digital Research Infrastructure and Portage, both of which happily coincided to be fostering research data, so data management as infrastructure. So data management in this country is funded as though it's infrastructure at this point, which is a big coup, and it was a big deal at quite a lot of money. And I think that helps, if you can be already proving that you can occupy this space to some degree, that you have credibility, that you're doing things, that your part is equally as valid as their money, that matters, I think, as well.
Thank you. Panelists who are online, would any of you like to respond to that question?
I'm happy to kind of to chime in additionally on this. One, I am of the camp, like, again, so you can, there has been over the last 10 years advocacy in a variety of different places on OERs, and even into to light successes or the minor ones from like a parliamentary committee. FINA incorporated into their 2018 FINA recommendations. Like, these are minor steps forward, but I think it's telltale of, like, this is the kind of thing that repetition is very important. And that's going in often. And I do think that it is always worthwhile to remind folks that you are going to get sick of your message. You are going to not be able to stand saying your message anymore, but it's probably the first time the person across from the table's heard it from you. And it is one of those things that naturally, especially in academic settings, I always think is important to kind of reiterate, is that you guys, some consistent messaging, and even if it is making you, even if you feel that you've repeated it a lot, again, just treat that everybody across the table, it's the first time they're being introduced those ideas until they are able to establish that otherwise. I think that, to Dawn's point, in areas like bilingualism, I think that there are good synergy potentials, like that. I think that if you're able to find ways, especially to be able to establish, like, there is other challenges that this may be able to solve. Textbooks in a variety of fields are not available in French after first and second year. This has been an ongoing access challenge across the country in post-secondary education, and that's been a particular challenge in advancing fields. Can OERs better respond to this question? That then opens up a different group that is able to access and respond through here, and it's able to shape and bring in more allies around that table. Last thing I guess I would just say is that I think the other challenge is, and I mentioned this before, depending on the department that's holding this, the problem we do also have is that both departments like I said, who again has the tri-agencies, so potentially through there, or Heritage, are generally not in the access business. Like, they just don't always see themselves as access points for students, especially. ESDC is generally seen as the department for that. So some of this is also just the internal operations of like, whose job is it to make sure that students can get into classrooms and be successful in classrooms? And sometimes it is that you're just dealing with bureaucratic structures that go like, that's not our job. We're ISED. We do other things here. And so being able to overcome some of those with messaging and being able to show, even for ISED, why that can be very valuable right now when some of their other priorities may not be top-notch government priorities, can be really effective too.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, I would like to invite anybody in the audience to ask a question of this incredible panel. Do we have anybody on Zoom, Andrea or Karen, who has a question? Not yet. Questions for the panel? Please go ahead.
Hello, advocacy, not my thing, but I really need to learn it. Question. How do I identify the politicians I need to talk to?
How do I identify the politicians I need to speak to was the question.
Alice?
I can say usually just quick searches of open government websites are pretty easy. Each province and the federal government has like their own version of an open database, ideally where there's updated contact information, emails and names and portfolios, as well as which MP, MLA is responsible for which files. And usually you can just start by fishing around. And my best advice is just to ask, right? Because it is their job to provide that information to people who are looking for it. And a lot of times if you ask politely and it's the wrong person, they will just connect you with their colleague who does have it. And then beyond that, I would say going to the next level, it's within different departments and within different ministries, different staff have different jurisdiction over which policy files they look at. So you first have to identify the MPs and the ministers who are your champions and have the jurisdiction, but then also the people within that staff that write the briefs and inform the minister's opinion on XYZ issue that you can send research to, that you can send your briefs to, so that hopefully then that minister will internalize the positive views, ideally, that you're advocating for, and then be able to advocate to them internally within their cabinet or caucus or whatever's kind of going on. But then you also set yourself up in the process as a credible stakeholder and somebody who ideally the government will go to when they have questions and when they come up in walls and when they try and navigate these problems as well. And so through doing that, giving your research, being a friend when you can and opposing when you have to and you think that you don't take, they're not taking your kind of route, is the best way to kind of get your foot in a door in an office and start building those relationships. But start with a Google, get and talk with somebody, and then just keep asking until the trail stops.
Thanks.
I'll just really quickly add to that. Mackenzie's advice is rock solid. I would also add, though, that there is no wrong person to advocate to. If you find yourself in a position where you have somebody in front of you, make the case, have your elevator pitch ready. You know, certainly we can't be everywhere at once, and we cannot possibly lobby everyone. So I think, you know, definitely follow Mackenzie's advice for whittling that down. But there's no wrong person to advocate to. They might tell you I'm not the person for that, but you've furthered the message, and that's a win.
I think, Michael, you wanted to respond as well. Go ahead.
Very quickly. And again, I can't see you in the room, so apologies on that. But I was going to say, where do you live? Who's your MP? Give them a shout. Like if it is one of those places about being able to start that the constituency connection is a fundamental one. And if that is being able to find a mechanism by just being able to have this issue raised in as many different places as possible and as frequently as possible, then honestly, that starts with put your postal code into Elections Canada, identify who your member of parliament is, send them an email and say, this is explain and can get clear, concise messaging. This is important. I'd love to be able to talk with you, and I'd love to be able to give you some more information about this really neat thing that would help Canadians, and I can show you how to do that.
Yeah, this is maybe more of a comment. I wanted to thank Michael for expressing this notion that, you know, we have to be careful of our vocabulary and if some of the people that we're speaking to will not know what we're talking about. I've said to many people, the term OER is incomprehensible unless you have a master's of library science or you're in a very, very small group. We're only talking to ourselves when we use that term. But some years ago, the Carl directors, we went off and we had a day on the Hill. We were given some training in how to do lobbying, and our topic was copyright. And we all practiced. We knew what we were going to say. We went in small teams and spoke to MPs. And I distinctly remember meeting with this one MP, and we spoke to him for about 20 minutes. And he's nodding sagely. And then he finally said, "Stop, can I stop you? I just need to ask one question." He said, "Are you for this or against this?" And it was this epiphany that he really, with copyright, actually didn't understand at all. And we really had to start from the very, very beginning. The other piece is it's not as scary as it appears to go off and meet with these individuals. And it's something really, you just have to brace yourself and go in and do it. But it's important.
Thank you, Vivian. I recall how powerful those conversations were, very eye-opening. I guess I just want to ask a question too. One of our panelists said, how can we help our politicians solve a problem for the constituents? And so I'm curious to hear from our panelists how we might bridge open education infrastructure with solving such a problem like that, or how we might go about thinking about an approach. Michael.
I will give you an example of one situation, especially with this Liberal government, that was effective when I was at CASA. So the Liberals expanded student grants significantly during their first budget. So we called up the Canada Student Loans Program and got a full list of, because they are able to track how much funding goes to each institution. And when we showed up on campuses to say like this was a really positive step and something we'd advocated before, we broke down the number of students, the amount of money that was being saved. If you can find an average amount that you're going to call being saved, and you multiply that number by the number of students in potentially a riding constituency or the closest institution that member of parliament can understand and have close, that's a tangible return to that member of parliament. They can understand the relationship there, and they can say, oh, I have Heritage College in my campus, so I'm across the river in Hull Elmer. That Heritage College has 1,000 students. This is able to save a bunch of those students, instead of the Calculus 101 textbook, which is $100 and maybe $200 now, which Calculus 101 hasn't shifted all that much. Like, this is a really good example of where there can be cost savings. In this instance, we're saving, 100 of those students each year, $200. There's your multiply out. And you can tell Greg Fergus, that's the deliverable that you're talking about in that context. So being able to find ways to root it, if it's a politician, rooted in their member, their member responsibilities, and come up with numbers that they can translate out, can be very, very effective to be able to demonstrate the value return. And if it's cost savings that the argument's going to be on, and if that's the one that's being anchored on, that's the thing that can be resonated. And honestly, with an Excel spreadsheet and a couple of days, you can come up with those numbers and create template letters that are relatively consistent. You can create those kind of things in a way that people are able to deliver. And I'd actually say the librarians would be fantastic at that. You guys you always impress me with those kind of things.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Michael.
So we know, and the CASA ask in 2017 was $8 million. And since then, we've seemed to kind of settled on 10 million because it's a nice round number. It's a little bit higher. And are we putting the cart before the horse in thinking out of a $10 million mindset, or how should we be thinking about costing of all of this?
I just want to point something, and that is that what happens with pre-budget submissions is that they go out to they get shopped around to whoever seems appropriate, and they get looked at and so on. So some of pre-budget submission, when we don't know how much we really should be asking for, which I would argue we still don't really have that clarity there, is planting seeds. It actually is about the persistence thing. It's basically saying, let's get consciousness raised that this is something that some groups in this country care about and are starting to express that the government should care about it. So, maybe that's not the ideal use of pre-budget submission, but it's kind of what we can do as a first step. It's not the only step. And I do think, these questions of raising it, talking to people, listening as well, you know, whether it's politicians or whether it's officials, trying to make meetings and sort of say, is this something that would interest you? Are we in the right department here? I am perfectly willing for us to not know in the federal government where is the right place to go for all of this. As long as we think, you know, we're relatively clear on what it is that we're looking for from the government, we can be asking and get referrals and sort of land. They can all say no if they want to, but then that doesn't mean we give up either. You know, I think, and these different voices can go in with different arguments that say the same thing, that take us to the same place. Really important. And there's, you know, policy change happens in various ways. It's not all about funding. It's not all about new money. I mean, there are programs that we might be able to exploit for existing money. There are things we can do with less money. We need to be clear that we're involving all layers, I think. It's something I meant to say earlier, that the notion that federal, provincial, institutional, and even within institutions, you know, libraries versus teaching and learning centers and so on, there's different financial contributions, different leads that can be possible to do different things. So that notion of a coordinated action plan matters. The other thing I would say is that if the department, so you have a champion department and you know, a department decides they really do care about this, they're going to, the minister is convinced and he wants to take it forward, tells his officials, they then have to see what they can propose, right? They will need to be thinking about options. Big option, I don't know, it's probably common sense, but there's like a Goldilocks thing, right? There's the option that's too big, that's too expensive. There's the option that's not enough. And then there's the kind of just right. And we don't maybe know that yet, but maybe we could get there so that we have a sense that what we're really aiming for, and we have the facts to support it. And we have the burning platform that says this is absolutely, Canada's falling behind. You know, these other countries are wonderful models. We need to act, you know, so I don't know. Anyway, all of that is, it helps, I think, to have the facts straight and the thinking done. And there's a lot that has been done. You guys have been great for documenting all sorts of things. And so we need to convey it now, I think.
Thank you, Susan. Dawn, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it might seem counterintuitive, but I tell clients all the time, it's just as hard to get $10 million as it is to get $40 million. I mean, like, if you think of the size of the federal budget, the real hurdle you have to cross is convincing the government that this is something they want to do out of the hundreds of thousands, well, tens of thousands of asks they get. And ironically, it's just as hard to get 10 million as it is to get 40. I guess the other kind of truism I always say is you're starting at a high watermark with your ask and you're getting negotiated down from there. So that's also something to keep in mind. It's very rare that someone gets 100% of what they asked for when they first come with their budget ask, if we're dealing in the budget cycle. The third thing I'd say is, you know, you don't have to have like a detailed costing sheet as part of your budget ask, but we've had clients, and I've seen it happen, where once you start to gain traction on the like the feasibility and the attractiveness of the ask, you will get asked questions about, so what is the 10 million for? And if you can't answer notionally what it's for, you have a massive problem. So they're not asking for like, show me the receipts or the costing estimates of, you know, sourcing this and that. But if it's like, well, we kind of just made it up, or I can't really allocate funds for different priorities. So you have to think about that when you go into your ask. But those are the kind of things I would encourage you to think about as you're solidifying your ask, and hopefully sort of consistent with the points people made before, the quantum of the ask is the same across all of the groups that are asking for it, so that there's a consistency of message.
Sorry, I guess the last thing I would just add really quickly is Dawn hit the nail on the head. You know, it really, when it comes down to the specific number, like I think we have a reference point with the US that we can use. Like that is a model that we can point to and say, you know, this amount of funding has worked and has had this impact. However, I think there's no harm at all in asking for more and receiving less than what that ask is. Like, say we ask for 20 million and we get 10, that's $10 million that we didn't have yesterday. You know what I mean? So we don't have to go with that model. There's a lot of different options. That is just, I think something to be prepared for, that if you ask for a certain amount of money, be prepared to perhaps get less.
Anne.
So Michael basically said, a few people said students are so important. But one thing that CASA was a leader in terms of getting OER into your pre-budget, but I know that it's been much harder for CFS because tuition has been such an issue. So see, we had 2 members of CFS, and because they had their annual meeting, I think one got sick and they're not here. I would love to, I think that this is something we can maybe share in the hybrid event, like what can happen. I know James was interested in getting it into an advocacy platform, but they basically said, and in the meetings I've had with some other stakeholders as well, they basically said it's hard to get OER into that top 3 priorities. So how do we tie that into the message? Is it a bundling should we bundle it with other things like student affordability and just as student affordability as a point? But I'm just trying to figure out how we actually get onto the groups that need to be on, putting it in through pre-budget to get that traction, how we get it on. Is that too big a question? I don't know, but.
I can try. So one of the things about student groups is they do turn over from year to year, which means there is new opportunities to set new direction. And I will say sometimes you just get students who are really passionate about open educational resources, and sometimes you get students who are passionate about other things. So it really is up to those students whether or not it makes it into the top priorities. And sometimes that will be yes, and sometimes that will be no. But I can say that one of the things that I'm hearing from students right now is that affordability is really a top concern. But usually when we try and tackle things like affordability, we go to targeted grants-based programs like Canada Student Loans, Canada Student Grants, and interest on those things. So budget cycle might not be students' favorite way to tackle something like open educational resources. But then again, we can do a bunch of different things because it is in the policy library we have at CASA. So you can advocate to different governmental committees who are doing studies and different policymakers behind the scenes as well. But I will say that the threshold for, and even myself, I see the threshold of getting it into that top 3 priorities as pretty steep. And it is the student's prerogative to choose whether or not that is what they'd like to use their year as an advocate for.
I think
Michael.
Seeing that we're close to time, I'll speak very quickly. So the nature of being able to build stakeholder alliances in Ottawa is its own thing. And if you, again, I would say identifying the groups that are necessary to be able to build a coalition that is able to support the political activity that you're looking to do. And in this case, if it's students who are kind of the key constituency, again, roughly the best window for that is usually that post-budget, early, late winter, early spring area where people haven't come up with their new ideas for next year. And they're providing their boards political assessments on opportunity, and then they're making assessments on gain. So especially in the PSE sector where a lot of the stakeholders operate they generally operate on a budgetary cycle for setting priorities in a year. You're looking for a window of opportunity at about there to be able to flag that there's a coalition of things coming together that would be useful and capable. If you raise the issue with people in September, it's way too late, for that year's advocacy. Everybody knows what they're doing. Everybody knows what they're focused on. And they're running mostly in that direction. And their own boards, especially because of their governance models, have made that commitment. Now, this will vary from organization to organization, but being able to understand some of the stakeholders across the table for me, like the students, again, the students have a new reset cycle every year. Pretty much as of May 1st, they're brand new into this world. And then they spend an entire year learning what they're about to do, and then they disappear again. So it's good. That's for a student cycle. Important for understanding how they can actually sign up to something and how they can be involved. It's important then to reach out to their staff and engage at that point to be able to make sure that even in their early process of developing priorities, it can be flagged and be clearly articulated to them. Again, depending on the other associations, I'm taking that 2 seconds to be like, so how do you guys work, and where do you set your priorities and how do you set your priorities, can give you a really good window into how they can be your ally, and that you don't show up at a point where they're going to be like, that's a great idea, but I can't do anything about that right now because of our governance model, or I've got 12 other priorities. So it seems like I'm actually in tension with you.
Thank you very much. With that last comment, we are at time. Can you all join me in thanking Haley, Susan, Dawn, Mackenzie, and Michael for all of their wisdom and advice for us. Thank you very much. While we're being set up for the next session, I just want to express my gratitude to Mackenzie, who has to leave us to go and get her graduate degree tomorrow, so she won't be joining us tomorrow. So congratulations on your master's degree.